We'll talk about bluffing on the river mostly from a position of strength, which is late position. Now, there's a thing called three-barreling. I guess all the new kids are coming out with new terminology, and they call it three-barreling, so I'll go with that. What three-barreling basically means is someone that's firing 3 bullets or 3 bets, one on the flop, one on the turn, and then one on the river as a complete bluff. It's a play that's really rarely done. For the most part, if poker players bet the flop on a bluff and you call, now they bet the turn and you call again, they'll usually give up on the river, assuming that you're probably going to call that bet too. But before you just give up, there are a few times when you'd actually want to three-barrel yourself. Okay? A lot of it is psychology based on your opponent. Maybe your opponent knows that you don't fire 3 bullets, so he may be calling you on the turn in a situation where he thinks, well, I'm calling on the turn, but if he bets the river, I'm just going to give it up. Now again, if these types of players think they know your style and they know that you only fire 2 barrels, you may be able to get away with firing a third one. However, the most important consideration, aside from psychology, is the board texture and what kinds of cards have come off. Okay? Now, if your opponent is check calling you on a flop of king 8 deuce, and then the turn comes a 9 and he check calls again, there's no flush draw, no straight draw. Now, you have to ask yourself, what in the world is this guy calling me with? He's not calling me with a drawing hand, so he must be calling me with a hand that he thinks is best. So betting the river against average to weaker players is usually futile because they're going to call you, and that's where you want to give up, really. Now, against a really good thinking player who's played a hand that weak, you may be able to make a big bet on the river and get him to fold a king because it looks like that's what he's got at this point. You know, you would think he has at least a pair of 8s, but the way he's playing the hand, he's certainly not drawing. So in those situations, when the flop comes like king 8 deuce, you don't need to fire the second barrel too often when someone calls you. If you have position, you might want to just check it down, and if you have any sort of a hand, you might want to try one more barrel. And again, none of those rules are static. None of these things are a roadmap to say, do this every time, because you really don't want to become predictable. Everything should be read dependent. Everything should be based on how your opponent perceives you. So, if your opponent thinks that you firing a second barrel means that you have it, then go ahead and do it sometimes. Don't do it all the time. Then again, sometimes if you think the third barrel might work because your opponent is going to give up a pair of kings, then go ahead and do that too. But let's look at other types of flops where you should maybe fire a third barrel, and your bet wouldn't necessarily have to be that big. When you have boards with draws on them, these are the kinds of hands that, even if you were on a draw, you might want to fire barrels at all the way through the hand. Let's say, for example, the flop comes Jack 10-4 with 2 hearts, and you find yourself in there with 8-9. Your opponent checks, and you raise before the flop. So after the flop, when your opponent checks, you decide to bet, he calls, and now the turn card pairs the 4. Your opponent checks, and let's say you decide to fire another barrel. Your opponent calls one more time. Well, at this point, your opponent probably has a jack, most likely, like an ace-jack, king-jack, or is there on a draw himself. So maybe king-queen, maybe he's got a flush draw. There's a whole myriad of possibilities for hands that he can have. Now let's say the river card is a deuce of clubs, complete blank, and your opponent checks again. Well, this is a situation where you certainly can't win in a showdown. I mean, you have 9 high after all. So this is a situation where three-barreling might not be terrible, but you have to know your opponent. You have to get a read that your opponent is not checking down a jack or a 10 to you because he's scared. You have to assume that there's a decent possibility he's drawing as well. Now, the bet size in this situation doesn't have to be monstrous because if your opponent has a drawing type of hand, he's not going to call you anyway. Whereas if he has the jack or the 10 and he decides that it's good, he's probably going to call a larger bet anyway. So, in this situation, what you should bet is an amount that looks like a value bet. You should bet an amount that's not so big that it looks like you're trying to scare your opponent, and not so small that he's going to make an easy call with a 10. You want to make a decent-sized bet of 50 to 60% of the pot. Value bet size, so it looks like a value bet, but of course, so that really your opponent thinks you want him to call. Anything more than that, and your opponent might be suspicious. Anything less, and your opponent just might get too curious, and who knows, even call you with a hand like ace-high, just assuming you're bluffing. So flop texture is really, really important when you're making bluffs and when you're deciding on whether or not to fire a third barrel. There are other types of river bluffing too. Say, for example, from out of position, you're in the big blind and someone has raised you, and you have jack 10. Flop comes king, queen, 5. You've checked your opponent, and now your opponent bets. Okay, this is a situation where you might check raise, and it's not a terrible play, though calling isn't that bad either. Okay, let's assume for this situation that you called. So the turn card comes a deuce. You check, your opponent checks, and that shows some weakness. Now your opponent here is likely betting if he had a king. He may have a queen and be checking it down, worried a little bit, or he just may have decided you've got something, so he's not going to bother bluffing anymore. Now the river card pairs a deuce, so there's nothing out there, and this is a situation where you have jack high, but if you make a bet here, the only hands that are going to call are maybe pocket pairs lower than the queen and the queen with a low kicker. Even if you do have that happen, it's still not a bad bet here to bet the jack 10 if you feel like you can get him to lay it down, because you've represented a queen the way you've played, so when you're out of position, your opponent's likely going to pick up on the fact that you've been checking down marginal hands in the flop to him, and then maybe, you're looking to value bet with a queen or a king in this situation. You can go ahead and bet here with your jack 10 and try to pick up the pot out of position. Sometimes you're going to get called, but that's okay. If you rarely bluff when you play poker and get caught every time you do, then you're probably not bluffing often enough, frankly. Sometimes you're going to get caught, and that's okay because it's good for your table image, as long as you adjust to what's going to happen here. Your opponents are going to play you differently if you get caught, and depending on the type of opponent you're playing against, you should adjust your river play accordingly.